All right, so some of the questions that the last podcast you did with Pressler, one of the things you guys touched on, which I thought was worth trying to get deeper into, was apparatus positioning for the engine and for the truck as well, but trying to figure out where people go wrong, looking for that one-size-fits-all approach. When does an engine take the front of the building? When does it pull past? What happens if you show up on a truck or a quint and it's an obvious working fire, but the fire's not showing? You know, what are the advantages of the engine getting there first and then positioning from that point? So I guess the first question is pulling past or taking the building? What's the decision process for the engine?
Well, it depends on the situation you got, the building that you got, how big it is and so forth. If it's a 2.5-story frame, the engine's coming from one direction, it generally should be expected to pull past the building. Now there's a couple things here before we start talking about it like that, is that hose beds and where they're located on the vehicle. Are you using crosslays for your attack lines, or do your attack lines come out the rear of the engine? And are you a fire department that has ladder trucks that are coming also? And if you're not, well, then these are all things that you need to think about. You mentioned quints. If that first engine coming in is actually a quint, what's the other 1 or 2 or 3 engines coming in with you? Are they also quints, or are they just regular trips, triple combination apparatus, no aerial device? So these are all things that we need to figure out before we even get to the scene to help us in our apparatus placement. So let's go back to the situation where we have an engine arriving first, 2.5-story frame, there's a ladder truck coming in. Engines, if you're operating out the back of the out the back of your engine through your hose beds, obviously you have to get past the fire building. Again, we've mentioned this before, the 3 sides of the building you get to see. We're talking a 2.5-story frame, so whether it's a newer neighborhood, suburban, or whether it's an old urban or older small town neighborhood with 40 or 50 foot wide lots, in each case you can pull that engine a little bit past the building to get those 3 sides to help you there. So that's another thing that we think about. How far back do the buildings sit from the curb or the street? That's the other thing that determines, your hose beds and your engine placement and so forth. If it's a suburban neighborhood and your houses are sitting 85 feet back from the street, that's 2 lengths of hose taken up right there. We've got a couple of neighborhoods out here. Those homes are going to eat up 2 lengths just to get from the street to the house. And then it's 3 stories when you look at the house, but as the land tapers off in the backyard, you see 4 stories. So this is the thing, that you need to look at, for your engine's placement, and especially if you're running pre-connected lines. Fire department that has these types of buildings in its neighborhoods or its response districts, you've got to take this into consideration. That's where static load comes in.
A lot of places like that, I guess, like this kind of township where you live, I see the common solution is some 1.75" bundled on the front bumper, and they plan on driving in. Now, of course, the problem is eventually you're going to have to cross some type of creek bridge, almost inevitably, right? So will your engine make it up the driveway? What's the weather conditions? I think in that respect, it's not a bad plan, but there's definitely some things to work out, and you have to make sure you know your first due that you can actually do that.
I think you're talking more of homes that sit way back off the road, they got one way in. And many fire departments with those conditions, this is like the advent of the rescue pumper.
Yeah.
Or the quint, the you-all do-all type of fire apparatus. You can only get one engine back there. It's got to carry a supply line. These houses sit 1,000 feet off the road. We need an 800-gallon water tank. We need 20-gallon foam tank of this and a 20-gallon foam tank of that, and we need this much hose because the houses are real big and so forth, you know. And it's that's a tough thing to deal with, but you can't put it all on one chassis. It's just as simple as that. Not unless you're driving a tractor trailer pumper, and that's not going to work.
So you've solved that placement issue with getting all available hands to the fire building, not spreading out your people.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, trying to get that company concept going.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure. Get the apparatus back there. If it's a working fire, well, then have the basic tools that an engine carries. You've got a whole list of stuff like that, that those engines can carry. But you also need other apparatus on the scene to help bring that other equipment. You can't expect one apparatus to bring everything that you're going to need in every fire. So it just isn't going to work. And what if that apparatus breaks down, has an accident on the way, or slips off the side of the driveway and so forth? Give you an example. I'll tell you what, years ago, in fact, I wrote an article on monster houses.
The McMansions.
Yeah, this was an 11,000 square foot house we were given to play with. And we burned 3 days, 3 complete days, man. And this was in a suburban setting that had a lot of closely built homes. So we were fortunate enough to be given this place to burn and do training work in. This gentleman was going to build a 14,000 square foot home on the same site once we got done burning it down. The interesting thing, there was only one way in. And this was in a city setting, a suburban city setting. So we looked at that, and that was part of the stuff that I put in the article that I wrote, and it was for Fire Engineering Magazine years ago, about the monster houses and things you have to take into account. Water supply. Wasn't a typical driveway that you drive straight in. This driveway came off of Main Street, went around this way, bent around this way. Again, people with those types of properties, they have those driveways that have aesthetics.
Right, privacy and
there you
whatnot,
go.
yeah.
So think about that. So one of the things I remember putting in that article was that we had a tower ladder that we were working with. Your engine goes in first. Well, like I say, you can't put everything in your engine, but get fire operations underway. But the other thing was, a structure like that, you need a tower ladder. You need ground ladders, you need the bucket, or an aerial device if that's what you got. But the thing is, you got to get that guy back there. Well, in the summertime, that's great. You can get a wheel off the driveway and may get yourself out of it. But in this type of weather, snowy, wet weather,
right.
apparatus like that gets off the driveway,
Mm-hmm.
he just threw out the anchor there, and nobody else is getting around him for that. So these are all things that would come with apparatus placement, knowing your neighborhood, knowing the challenges, and so forth. So, yeah, that's a tough thing, like I say,
so
to overcome.
in a different scenario where typical urban or suburban area where you got an offset from the street, maybe 40, 50 feet, obvious working fire, you got fire involving the second floor and the attic, it's through the roof. You're showing a couple of windows on the A side, maybe 1 or 2 on one of the other sides. You're thinking stretch in, pull past, deck gun. I mean, what's the general good rule of thumb between deciding the 2.5 versus the deck gun?
Give me that scenario again.
2.5 story frame,
Okay.
fire on the second floor,
Okay.
coming out A side windows, and it's also through the roof.
It's also through the roof.
So it's in
Okay.
2 different areas.
Yeah, well, obviously, you've got heavy fire in the second floor and heavy fire in the attic, because fire's through the roof, is that?
Yeah.
Okay. You can make the effort if you have like 2-inch hose as a minimum size, if you want to try to make an offensive attack up the stairwell and handle it from there. But again, some people are going to, boo-hoo that. They're going to say, oh, it's too dangerous, the fire's already through the roof, and it could collapse on you. Well, there's no question that it could, okay? But that's where experience comes in, okay? Maybe getting the line up the stairs, start hitting it from maybe halfway up the stairs, start full open, start working it, and see what the effect of the stream has on the fire at that point. If it doesn't, well then, hey, you know what, then let's back it out, and we'll have to, come up with plan B. But see, that's the thing about, not seeing what your stream can do if it's in the right place. Let's try it. Right there at like I say, midway up the stairs, or as close as you can get. And start flowing the water. See what effect it has, and so forth.
So using the deck guns versus a 2.5 is a real judgment call based on what kind of building it is, and your experience, your crew, water supply. I mean, all the issues. So that it's funny. We're trying to talk about apparatus placement, but it all comes down to an experienced decision maker.
Yeah, it does. In so many cases, it does. That's what wins or loses the battle in many cases. Are you willing to write it off? And I don't think we should be doing that. When you talk about positioning your apparatus, are you positioning it to attack the fire, or positioning it to be in a defensive mode? In that case, people are going to say, "Oh, park the apparatus back here. We'll hit it with the deck gun. It's got good reach, and so forth, and that'll keep the building from falling on our engine, stuff like that, But if you're positioning it to pull a line, stretch it in, and start attacking the fire, that's different. So like I said, you'd be surprised. A lot of times, the experience of the officer, comes to play. Get the line upstairs, see what it can do. And again, I'm going to put a lot in the officer's lap right here, and that is, when you arrive in a situation like that, you got fire second floor and through the roof. Okay, fine. He should be looking at this situation, see if there's anything like a wall bowing or the rest of the roof is ready to collapse inward. Well, if they have telltale signs that there's going to be other collapses or outward collapses or something like that, yeah, it's a defensive operation. We're not going to send guys into a building that's going to fall down on them, okay? So that's the thing, But if it looks like it's coming through the roof in one particular area, we got fire showing from a few windows on the second floor in a particular area, we can get up the stairs and maybe hold the stairs right at that point. It's worth the shot.
Yeah.
It's worth the shot. So
I think that one of the things I was listening, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but Pressler was making a good point in the podcast on the Senior Man a few days ago, where think about that decision maker needs to understand what would the truck boss be wanting to do. If the truck boss is looking at the building saying, okay, this is not a roof operation,
right,
I'm going to be doing search as my priority. That should also kind of play into your engine officer's decision whether or not he stops in front of the building or pulls past deck gun or 2.5 or 2 inch. I mean, because if in that scenario the fire's through the roof, ventilation is not going to be the priority.
Right.
So clearing the front of the building for the truck isn't necessarily the priority. Would you agree?
The priority?
Right. The initial priorities
yeah,
of positioning.
Sure. Yeah, that's one of those principles of the job that we should be into. The time that an engine should be in front of the building is if we're going into a deck gun operation. There's your defensive operation where we have to position the engine to where it can do its job. Okay, so if that's the case, then position the engine accordingly. It gets the building. But if not, well, then the truck gets the building.
Yeah.
And believe me, there's a couple of variables there too. If you got like a tower ladder, and it's a kind that you guys can put the bucket down on the ground, you can drive it into the first floor, you can drive it into the second floor, we've got a lot of capabilities. He gets the building for sure.
Yeah.
Stuff like that. So these are the things, what you're doing is taking a defensive tool and making an aggressive defensive tool out of it. In other words, we're going to go after this fire with that mentality. We're going to beat the hell out of it. We're going to kill it, okay, with this big guy right here. And that engine should be the supply unit then for the tower.
Makes sense.
Now again, here again, initial arrival of the engine. Here comes the tower ladder. Does it have a mid-mount turntable or does it have a rear-mount turntable? That's going to make a heck of a lot of difference too, because if the engine stops and blocks that truck from getting into the building, and it's got a rear-mount turntable, 40 feet to the rear of the cab, you're blowing her out the street, So these are things that, again, there's so many things to think about. We don't think about that.
The variables are endless, really.
Exactly, right.
It depends on who.
So that's when we fall back on the principle of the job.
Exactly.
Okay. The people didn't hear, but we were all having a conversation among ourselves before we did our podcast the other day. You know,
Oh, yeah?
Just talking, shooting the bull, and so forth. We were talking about the old truck boss. You know, trucks always had a boss in the old days. And Bob was saying, yep. He says, and if the truck boss was off, they slid the engine boss over to the truck. I says, Bob, that's exactly how my fire department operated. You know, and he said the engines would get an acting guy, but the trucks would always have a boss. I says, that's exactly how my department operated too. That's how important the trucks and their truck boss is there to make a decision. That's how important they were back then.
And I don't think that was because engine work is less important or less of a decision-making process. It's just more often than not, the default is attack the fire with the water. There's no what could we be doing? Whereas with the truck work, obviously there's a lot of initial decision-making to be done according to the scenario and all the variables.
A real truck boss is somebody, once again, who's honed his skills, put his time on a truck, pulled a lot of ceilings, opened a lot of roofs and things like that, and has seen the environmental effects on fire, seen how fire can spread through a building quickly with no environmental effects. In other words, he's a guy who's been there, done that, been able to say, this fire's going here, I want to start operations here. Hey, line, you guys need to start your line in over here. In other words, that's why he had the name, and Kimball mentioned it in his book there, the combat engineer. That's what it was all about, having somebody with some presence of mind to figure this fire out, where it's going, what it's eating up in its path, okay, and what do we got to do to stop it? And that's what he was all about. Guys, on the end, look, I put over, Jesus God, you know.
You don't have to say.
Yeah, right, long time on an engine. And when you're, how do you say it, you know, you've got an idea of where the line can go, or what you can do with your line and so forth, or where it should go in a lot of cases and so forth. But it always helps to have another set of eyes on the scene. Say, hey, engine, bring your line over here. You know, here's where we're going to start, guys, okay? I've got ventilation coming over here in this part of the building right now. To hear those words, you know, especially when you're a young fireman, you're picking this stuff up, you know? And the boss is telling you, I want you to start over here. I got this taken care of. This is what's going to happen. You know, it's like, wow, you know, that was the old days, you know? So we talked about chiefs, by the way, getting into engines. The old chiefs would be all over that fire ground, you know? The truck boss was the forerunner to the 360.
Yeah.
He was the guy to make sure that building got attention on all four sides. The positioning of the apparatus, the engine pulls past the building, we see three sides, we haven't even gotten out of the cab yet. Everybody was taught that. Now we got guys in the back of the cab going to a fire, they got their app phone on, they're talking, or they're doing pictures or something like that, not even paying attention to what's going on or what they should be looking for when they're going into a fire situation and so forth. So you see all these things probably have worked against good principles and practices and so forth. So, but this is the way it was. I remember chiefs who were in the fire, around the fire, over to the pump panel, reading the gauges right along with the pump operator. I think Jeff mentioned that, you know, thought that was kind of unique, you know, when I mentioned that the other day in the podcast. But that's the way it was. Chiefs, that was their fire. You were their people. That was their building that was burning, and he was doggone, you know, going to make sure that we stopped that fire the best that we could, so forth. So, you know, different times, but
yeah.
You know, it was different. If you don't have that history in your background to fall back on, talk to an older guy.
That's about it too.
A conscientious older guy.
Yeah.
There's a lot of older guys out there. Not every one of them was conscientious about the job.
Yeah.
So.
All right, man. That was a good one. I think the apparatus placement discussion is very unique to each individual fire department and what they're dealing with. But the principles are always going to hold true.
Well, that's what the job is all about. You can throw all the science and technology you want at it, and we can use some of that also. We said that before. We can employ science, we can employ technology where it fits, but we don't use those things to change the job. And this is what's happened recently. We've had a bunch of people who, for whatever reason, have said, oh, firefighting is a science. No, it's not a science. Never has been and never will be. We can take some science to help us out. I mean, take a look at your SCBAs, your turnout gear, the materials that we use in those. Yeah, that was some scientific testing that we had to do. When you take a look at how the material was tested for its strength from different kinds of heat levels and things like that, durations. Yeah, that's where we're going to use science to help us for our own personal protection. But same thing with technological advances. We've talked before about nozzles and so forth. Okay, talk about the engine's placement. How close to the fire building should it be? How long of a hose stretch do you want to make? That relates to the kind of materials that we're using now to build our hoses and manufacture our nozzles that allows us to have greater flows at a greater distance while trying to keep the pump pressure low so it's a manageable hose line.
Yeah.
So we have all these things, science from technology, that are helping us, but that's not firefighting. Firefighting is all about principles and practices. Don't ever forget that. So, yeah. And the experience. Never let somebody tell you that experience doesn't matter. That's probably somebody talking who doesn't have a lot of experience or hasn't put a lot of time in the streets.
Yeah,
So,
go figure.
Yeah.
All right.
I can get on a roll here, but I won't.
Yeah, I'm not going to let you get on a roll.